She waits in the sitting room of Dr. Edmund Carter's private practice, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trembling faintly despite the stifling heat of the London summer. Her gloved fingers press into the fabric of her dress. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore has been here before 3 times in the last month, yet each visit still carries a sense of disgrace, though she cannot quite articulate the reason why. The gas lamp flickers above, throwing shifting shadows across the mahogany walls, which are lined with leather-bound medical texts she has never opened and would not dare to touch. Her afflictions had started subtly. First, the sleeplessness. Then, the agitation that made her speak sharply to the servants over minor matters. The faint quiver in her hands during afternoon tea. The suffocating pressure in her chest that made breathing feel like a conscious effort rather than an involuntary one. 3 weeks earlier, at a social gathering, she had endured what she could only term a violent internal upheaval. A sudden, convulsive feeling that left her flushed and short of breath, compelling her husband to lead her from the drawing room in quiet dignity. She had consulted 2 other doctors before Dr. Carter. Both had merely suggested rest, hydrotherapeutic baths, and various bitter tinctures that left her mind clouded. Neither provided a true diagnosis, much less a cure. But Dr. Carter was different. He was younger, modern in his approach, the sort of doctor who read the latest medical publications from Germany and France, who spoke with absolute authority on the nature of female ailments. When she entered his consultation room, he did not bother with small talk. He listened as she detailed her symptoms, his pen scratching across paper, occasionally nodding with solemn recognition. "Hysteria," he finally declared, the word hanging between them like a sentence. "A rather common condition for women of your standing, I'm afraid. The female nervous system is a delicate instrument, you understand, far more vulnerable to disruption than the male constitution." She had heard this before, but something in his demeanor suggested he didn't just accept it as fact. He comprehended it, could trace its path to physiological origins. "The womb," he continued, warming to his subject, "exerts a profound influence over the entire female system. When it is left unfulfilled, when its essential purposes are obstructed, it grows restless. This restlessness expresses itself as the precise symptoms you describe." Adelaide felt her face grow warm. Unfulfilled. She was a respectable married woman. Surely he did not mean... But he was already gesturing toward a privacy screen in the corner of his office. "If you will disrobe and lie upon the examination table, we shall commence your treatment immediately. The condition responds quite favorably to proper intervention, particularly when addressed early." She changed behind the screen, her heart pounding against her ribs. When she emerged, draped in a plain white sheet, Dr. Carter had already arranged his instruments on a small tray. There was a bottle of oil, smelling of lavender and roses. There were cloths. There was an expression on his face of professional focus, entirely devoid of impropriety. The examination table was leather and cold, despite the summer warmth. She lay back, her upper body still covered, only the area beneath her waist exposed. Dr. Carter was all efficiency, his manner bearing the full weight of medical authority. He positioned himself between her legs and began to apply the scented oil with measured, deliberate motions. At first it felt clinical, cool, medicinal, but then his fingers began to move with greater intention, rubbing in circles, pressing more deeply, discovering sensitive places whose existence she had never known. She wanted to speak, to protest, but no words would come. Dr. Carter had not requested consent for any of this. He simply proceeded as if this were a standard medical inspection. His movements quickened slightly. The sensation rising within her was unlike anything she had ever felt, frightening and all-consuming. Her breathing grew shallow. Her muscles began to tighten and release against her will, and then, a sudden violent unclenching. Her back arched off the table, her hands gripped the edges. For a moment everything dissolved into pure feeling, into a detonation of pressure and relief. And something so alien to her lived experience, she could not have named it to save her life. When it was over, she lay panting, her skin flushed, her entire body shuddering with something that felt dangerously close to bliss. Dr. Carter stepped away, already making notes on his clipboard as if he had merely tested her knee-jerk response. "Excellent," he said, almost to himself. The paroxysm was quite pronounced. "You should experience immediate alleviation of your symptoms. I would like to see you again next Thursday. Twice weekly for the next month would be optimal." She dressed in silence, her thoughts whirling. What had just occurred? What had he done to her? And why did she feel the most peculiar compulsion to agree with his instruction to return? If you are fascinated by these dark histories, if you find a certain morbid intrigue in how spectacularly wrong educated individuals can be, leave a like and subscribe. Ring the notification bell as well. I am genuinely curious about where you are listening from. I want to know which corners of the globe find this particular brand of medical catastrophe most compelling. Comment below. Tell me your location. Now, let us understand how an entire profession managed to spend 2 centuries providing women with orgasms while keeping a perfectly straight face about it. The idea did not spring from Victorian thinking. Long before Dr. Carter's clinic existed, before London's gas lamps lit its avenues, the ancient world had already determined what was fundamentally defective about women. The Egyptians believed it first, but the Greeks gave it form and a name. Hippocrates, the man Western medicine reveres as its founder, observed women suffering from anxiety, fits, and various nervous disorders, and reached a simple conclusion. Their internal organs were literally journeying. Hysteria, the Greek term for uterus. Hippocrates theorized that when a woman remained unmarried, when her womb received no regular attention from a man, the organ would become discontent. It would detach from its proper anchors and wander through her body cavity like a lost creature. As it traveled, it would press against other organs, pinching nerves, disturbing circulation, causing a cascade of symptoms that appeared to strike erratically across the female form. Plato took this concept further. He described the uterus not as a mere organ, but as an animal inside an animal, a being possessed of its own will and cravings, desperate to accomplish its reproductive fate. If a woman thwarted this desire, if she remained childless, her uterus would grow furious, it would revolt, and the woman would pay for this biological defiance. The cure seemed obvious to ancient physicians: marriage and pregnancy. Satisfy the womb's requirements, and the woman would be healed. This was not cruelty disguised as medicine, it was logic, as sound as geometry. Women's bodies had a function. If that function went unaccomplished, naturally, something would go awry. The surprise was not that women became hysterical. The surprise was that so many did not. By the Renaissance, something had changed. Physicians had started to doubt the literal truth of the wandering womb theory. Dissections of female cadavers showed that the uterus did not actually travel around the body. It was held in place by various ligaments and structures. There was no mechanism for it to journey. But here is where history takes a turn toward the truly ludicrous. They kept the diagnosis anyway. Even as medical knowledge progressed, even as anatomy grew more precise, hysteria remained. It simply expanded. If it was not a wandering womb causing the issue, it was something else. Something about the female reproductive system's inherent instability. The symptoms stayed vague enough to include almost anything. Nervousness, hysteria, insomnia, hysteria, muscle spasms, definitely hysteria, shortness of breath, hysteria, loss of appetite, absolutely hysteria, irritability, the very definition of hysteria. There was also a particularly circular diagnosis: sexual frigidity combined with sexual forwardness. A woman could be hysterical for displaying too much sexual interest or too little. She could be hysterical for being too emotional or for being too aloof. The condition was infinitely flexible, capable of absorbing any conduct that did not fit the narrow confines of what a respectable woman should be. By the Victorian era, hysteria had become the default diagnosis for female discontent, and physicians began to formulate a comprehensive theory for why women were so susceptible to these nervous ailments. Thomas Sydenham, an English doctor, calculated that hysteria was the most common illness after fever itself, impacting roughly 1/4 of all women. 1/4. That is not a disease. That is the majority of the female experience being pathologized. The Victorian medical establishment had developed an elaborate theory about female physiology that would be comical if the repercussions had not been so vast. Women, they believed, were fundamentally different beings from men, more fragile, more nervous, more sensitive. The female constitution was built differently, organized around reproductive capacity rather than intellectual or physical performance. The uterus, they taught medical students, was the command center of the female body. Everything else, the nervous system, the brain, the heart, was subordinate to it. This was not discussed in vague philosophical terms. Victorian medical textbooks provided detailed explanations of how the uterus transmitted signals throughout the female body, how it influenced mood, vigor, digestion, mental sharpness. A woman's entire personality and capability were theoretically tethered to her reproductive system. The implication was clear. Women were not designed for strenuous intellectual work. They were not designed for physical exertion. They were not designed for independence. They were meant to fulfill their reproductive role, and any departure from this natural function would lead to nervous derangement. The physician would prepare his equipment. Bottles of scented oils, lavender and rose were most common, though some used plain mineral oil, clean cloths, and occasionally more elaborate devices designed to improve efficiency. He would begin the massage with broad, general movements, gradually becoming more focused. His hands would work in circular patterns, pressing and releasing, locating sensitive areas, building intensity. The examination rooms themselves were designed with this psychological management in mind. High ceilings prevented any sense of intimacy. Detailed medical charts hung on the walls, keeping the visual focus on the clinical and scientific. A small table held instruments, reinforcing the medicinal nature of the space. Some offices featured screens that allowed the physician to approach from an angle that minimized eye contact, reducing any sense of personal involvement. Everything about the physical environment was engineered to uphold the pretense that nothing inappropriate was taking place. The appointment itself followed strict protocols. The woman would be instructed to remain quiet. If she voiced discomfort, she was reassured that this was part of the therapeutic process. If she seemed to be experiencing pleasure, though this was never described in those terms, the physician would maintain his clinical demeanor, discussing symptoms or the progress of treatment as if commenting on a patient's pulse or temperature. Some physicians kept detailed records documenting not just the treatment, but the patient's responses. These records, written in clinical language, meticulously describe the physical manifestations of orgasm without ever using that word. Muscle contractions, flushing, rapid respiration, vaginal lubrication. Each observation was recorded in the detached tone of scientific observation. Dr. Nathaniel Highmore, writing in 1660, described what he witnessed. The afflicted woman would experience violent contraction and relaxation of the muscles accompanied by flushing of the face, a feeling of heat throughout the body, and in many cases, a copious discharge of secretions followed by a state of profound relief and calm. This description is clinically accurate. It is also a description of an orgasm. But Victorian physicians could read this and not recognize it as such because the medical education they had received had essentially erased female sexuality from existence. Medical textbooks showed detailed anatomical drawings of male reproductive anatomy, but treated the female version with remarkable vagueness. Others omitted it entirely. Consequently, physicians received their entire medical training without ever learning that this small structure was a center of sexual sensitivity. They literally did not know it existed in any functionally meaningful way. Medical school lectures reinforced this framework relentlessly. Students learned that the female body was essentially unsteady, prone to nervous collapse, vulnerable to sudden disturbance. The female reproductive system was presented as a source of peril, not just to the woman herself, but to society. An unsatisfied woman was a threat. A frustrated woman was a liability. An educated woman, supposedly draining her reproductive organs by thinking too much, was committing a form of physical betrayal. The theories extended into minute details. Heavy menstruation was not a natural biological process. It was a sign of hysteria. Absence of menstruation was also hysteria. Irregular cycles, hysteria. The entire reproductive process was pathologized, turned into a source of potential illness. Puberty was medically hazardous for girls. Motherhood was understood as curative only if it resulted in pregnancy. Single women who remained childless were viewed as medically at risk. This created a self-fulfilling medical prophecy. If you begin with the assumption that women are inherently nervous and prone to collapse, and you interpret all their complaints through that lens, then of course you will find supporting evidence everywhere. A woman reports trouble sleeping, that's hysteria. She's anxious, hysteria. She's irritable, definitely hysteria. The diagnosis was infinitely adaptable, capable of encompassing nearly any human experience a woman might report to a physician. Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential Victorian physicians, published his views on this matter with characteristic bluntness in 1857. The majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This became medical doctrine. The idea that respectable women, and by respectable they meant middle class and above, had no sexual desires whatsoever. They might endure sexual contact with their husbands as a marital obligation. But the notion that they could experience pleasure, that they might have their own sexual needs, was considered not just improbable, but medically impossible. A woman who confessed to sexual desire was by definition unrespectable, probably hysterical, possibly dangerous. This created a profound paradox at the heart of Victorian medical practice. Physicians acknowledged that hysteria afflicted millions of women. They documented the symptoms meticulously. They recognized that these women were suffering, yet they remained completely blind to the most obvious explanation. These women were experiencing the symptoms of sexual frustration while living in a society that denied female sexuality entirely. Here is where the treatment emerges, rising from this fog of contradictions and blindness like something inevitable and yet utterly implausible. By the mid-19th century, physicians had settled on a standard treatment for hysteria: pelvic massage. The theory was straightforward within the logic of the time. If the uterus was the source of the trouble, if it was creating nervous symptoms through its restlessness, then the solution was to induce what they termed a hysterical paroxysm through manual manipulation of the genital area. A woman would make an appointment. She would arrive at the physician's office, often weekly, sometimes twice weekly. She would be led to an examination room and told to disrobe from the waist down while keeping her upper body and face concealed for modesty. This detail is critical. The face was covered so that both physician and patient could pretend this was not happening. The psychological mechanism of denial was built directly into the procedure. Dr. Russell Thorpe, writing in 1903, complained extensively about the treatment's demanding nature. Achieving hysterical paroxysm, he wrote, could require up to an hour and a half of continuous manipulation, making it among the most tedious and exhausting of medical procedures. The physical demand placed upon the physician is considerable. The language is extraordinary. A trained physician with steady hands and medical authority complaining about how physically tiring it is to manually stimulate women to orgasm. And he had no idea that is what he was complaining about. He genuinely believed he was performing a medical duty like setting broken bones or lancing boils. It was simply exhausting work. And the problem he identified, the exhaustion, would lead to one of history's most unintentionally ironic inventions. The scale of this practice became staggering. By the late 19th century, physicians estimated that 75% of American women suffered from hysteria. 75%. If we consider what that actually means, 3 out of every 4 women diagnosed with a disease, treated regularly, often weekly for years, the numbers begin to compound. In major cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, certain physicians specialized exclusively in hysteria treatment. They became wealthy doing it. Dr. Taylor's practice in New York advertised complete relief from nervous exhaustion and female troubles, and employed multiple physicians on staff specifically to handle the volume of patients. The waiting rooms were full. The appointment books were packed months in advance. Some women appear in these books with entries for years. Every Thursday at 2 p.m., same time, same treatment, week after week, stretching into decades. The treatment was not limited to physicians' offices. Wealthy women could arrange for house calls where a physician would come to the home, often with a nurse in attendance for propriety. But the most fashionable and most profitable option was the hydrotherapy resort. Specialized clinics throughout Europe advertised water-based hysteria treatments. The procedure involved directing powerful jets of pressurized water at the patient's genitals while she sat on specially designed chairs with cut-out seats. The French called it la douche pelvienne, the pelvic shower. These were not marginal medical facilities. They were luxury destinations. Bath in England became famous for its hysteria water treatments. Baden-Baden in Germany marketed itself as a center for female nervous complaints. Women would travel from across Europe to spend weeks at these establishments, receiving multiple treatments daily. The water cure was considered more refined than manual massage, less obviously intimate despite achieving identical results. An advertisement from Baden-Baden in 1875 promised complete restoration of feminine vitality through the scientific application of thermal waters combined with the latest electrical innovations. Women leave our facility renewed, revitalized, and restored to their proper role in society. Patient testimonials described miraculous transformations. One woman wrote about feeling invigorated beyond measure after her treatment course. Another described returning home with my spirits entirely restored, and my husband noting a remarkable return to my wife's cheerfulness and capacity for domestic duties. Of course, they felt invigorated. They had been receiving regular orgasms in a society where sexual pleasure for women was supposed to be impossible, unthinkable, forbidden. The relief was not just physical, it was psychological, a rare form of accepted pleasure, medicalized and therefore acceptable. The entire system was built on this exquisite ignorance. The woman knew something was happening. At some level, she understood that these appointments met some need in her. The patient testimonials hint at this understanding, though it is buried under layers of acceptable medical language. But she could not articulate it. To articulate it would be to admit she had sexual feelings, which meant she was unrespectable, which meant she was the problem, not her uterus. The physicians had no idea at all. They were genuinely performing what they believed to be medicine. They were maintaining professional distance through clinical language and the strategic placement of sheets. They went home to wives they believed had no sexual desires. They attended medical conferences and presented papers on the efficacy of different techniques for inducing paroxysms, never once questioning why they were doing this. Then came the problem that would accelerate everything. The doctors' hands were tired. By the 1880s, as hysteria diagnosis had spread and the volume of patients had grown exponentially, some physicians began to experience occupational strain. A man doing pelvic massage on dozens of women per week, sometimes for over an hour per patient, develops serious hand and wrist problems. The repetitive motion causes inflammation, arthritis, and genuine pain. Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, a London physician, was one such sufferer. His hands were giving out from the relentless demand for pelvic massage. He was a smart man, educated, innovative, and he was exhausted. In 1883, he did what any clever engineer would do when faced with repetitive manual labor. He mechanized it. He developed a device called the percuteur, powered by an electromagnetic engine, capable of producing rapid vibrations at adjustable speeds. The vibrations could be delivered through various attachments, but the principle was the same. Let the machine do what had previously required a doctor's hands. Granville was initially adamant that his device was meant for treating male muscle disorders, but physicians working with female patients quickly recognized its application. The Weiss Company catalog from 1906 offered more than 20 different models, each with specific claims about efficiency, design, and therapeutic benefit. There were vibrators that could be attached to furniture, specially designed chairs with built-in vibrating mechanisms for patient comfort. The Chattanooga vibrator advertised that it could relieve hysteria symptoms in under 10 minutes. The White Cross electric vibrator promised the essence of life itself delivered to your very door. These were not niche medical devices. By 1900, the vibrator had become the fifth most common electrical appliance in American homes, more widespread than electric fans or electric lights in many communities. Sears and Roebuck, the dominant retailer of the era, advertised vibrators in their general catalog. The 1908 Sears catalog featured a home vibrator with text describing it as very useful and satisfactory for home service. There were no elaborate euphemisms. It was marketed alongside toasters, sewing machines, and other labor-saving devices for the home. This is where we enter truly surreal territory. Vibrators were being advertised in women's magazines, sold through mainstream retail, featured in household product catalogs. One 1910 advertisement showed a woman using a vibrator on her face with text proclaiming, "Vibration is life. The secret of the ages has been discovered in vibration. Great scientists tell us that we owe not only our health, but even our life strength to this wonderful force." The advertisements maintained the fiction of respectability through careful language. They emphasized efficiency, modern science, and the benefits to female health. They spoke of nervous relief, restoration of vitality, and renewed capacity for domestic duties. They were brilliantly misleading because they were technically accurate, while being profoundly deceptive about what was actually happening. And through it all, nobody involved seemed to understand what was occurring. Physicians published detailed clinical papers about the technique of inducing hysterical paroxysms. Medical journals carried advertisements for the latest vibrator models. Women purchased home vibrators and used them regularly, often with their husband's knowledge and approval because it was a legitimate medical treatment. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. A physician would spend his afternoon inducing paroxysms in female patients. He would write detailed clinical notes describing the muscular contractions, the flushing, the relief. Then he would go home to his wife, whom he believed had no sexual desires, and maintain conjugal relations with the confidence that he was engaging in a purely reproductive act, not a sexual one. John Harvey Kellogg, the cereal magnate, embodied this contradiction perfectly. He operated a large sanitarium where he treated hysteria and other nervous complaints with vibrators and electrical devices. Simultaneously, he crusaded against masturbation as a dangerous evil that would destroy the moral and physical health of the nation. He wrote extensively about the horrors of self-abuse, recommending clitoridectomy as a cure for girls who engaged in masturbation. He advocated for male circumcision to make masturbation physically more difficult. He never made the connection between the orgasms he was inducing medically and the sexual pleasure he was simultaneously warning against. The same act performed by a physician with clinical intent was healing. The same act performed by a woman on herself was dangerous and depraved. The distinction was not based on the physical reality. It was based entirely on context and intention, or at least the claimed intention. And yet, some women understood. They might not have been able to articulate it in the language of sexuality. That language did not exist for respectable women, but they understood that these appointments met a need. The evidence is scattered through the historical record, hidden in the gaps between medical terminology and human reality. Diary entries from the era contain hints. One anonymous woman wrote in 1892, "My weekly appointments with Dr. Harrison have quite restored my spirits. I find myself looking forward to Thursday afternoons with great anticipation, though I couldn't explain to anyone why." Another woman noted that the treatment, though peculiar in nature, provides a relief and restoration, unlike any tonic or medicine prescribed to me. Women recommended their physicians to each other. Networks formed. Certain doctors became known among women as particularly effective at hysteria treatment. Some physicians maintained waiting lists with dozens of women requesting appointments. The demand was not coming from physicians pushing treatment on reluctant patients. The patients were actively seeking it out, recommending it to friends, maintaining regular appointments over years and decades. One letter from a wealthy Boston woman to a friend explicitly recommends a particular physician's practice, noting that his treatments have a most remarkable effect on one's disposition and energy. Another woman writes that she has transferred her care to a different physician after finding his treatment method superior, suggesting that women were shopping around, comparing practitioners, seeking the most effective providers. Husbands occasionally complained about the frequency of these appointments or expressed curiosity about the nature of the treatment, yet they seemed unable to object to what was medically prescribed. If a doctor recommended weekly or twice-weekly visits, who was a husband to argue? The physician was the authority. The treatment was medically sanctioned. To suggest something improper was occurring would have been to cast doubt on the medical establishment itself. Some women requested female physicians or complained when regular practitioners were unavailable, wanting continuity of care with someone they were comfortable with. Others carefully maintained the appointments within their household schedules, sometimes without their husband's knowledge, finding ways to fit multiple visits into their social calendars. The physical effects of the treatment were undeniable. Women reported feeling invigorated, restored to health, capable of managing their domestic duties with renewed energy. They genuinely felt better, emotionally, physically, spiritually. The relief was profound and noticeable enough that they would travel significant distances to maintain access to their physicians, that they would recommend them enthusiastically to other women, that they would endure the costs and the time commitment willingly. For women whose sexual desires had been systematically denied, whose sexuality had been declared non-existent, whose bodies had been taught to them as instruments of reproduction rather than sources of pleasure, this treatment represented something extraordinary. It was the only space in their lives where their bodies were attended to with this intensity, where sensation mattered, where something that felt undeniably good was happening, even if it could not be named. The medical establishment's ignorance of female sexuality, maintained through deliberate omission in medical education, had allowed something remarkable to occur. For decades, millions of women received regular sexual satisfaction through the medical system, while everyone involved maintained the fiction that nothing sexual was happening. It is almost impossible to overstate how much cultural work had to go into maintaining this blindness. Medical schools taught anatomy through dissection and detailed drawings. Yet the clitoris was omitted or dismissed. Textbooks that could describe male reproductive anatomy in elaborate detail would describe female anatomy in vague generalities. Medical professors lectured about hysteria symptoms and treatment without once suggesting that the symptoms might relate to sexuality or that the treatment was inducing sexual response. This was not accidental. This was systematic educational erasure. Students were literally trained not to see. They learned to apply the vocabulary of clinical detachment to procedures that were fundamentally sexual without anyone ever using that word. Within a few years, vibrators essentially disappeared from mainstream medical practice. The Sears catalog dropped vibrator advertisements by 1925, not gradually but seemingly overnight, pulled from circulation as though acknowledging their existence had been an embarrassment. Medical journals stopped featuring them. Advertisements that had run for decades vanished. Physicians quietly abandoned the practice of pelvic massage. The devices that had been sitting in medical offices across the country, used on thousands of women weekly, were discreetly disposed of. What had been a standard medical treatment became taboo almost overnight. The speed of this transformation is striking, not because the practice changed, but because the context changed. The same technology performing the same function suddenly became impossible to justify in medical terms, once the sexual nature of what was happening could no longer be denied. Hysteria as a formal diagnosis survived another few decades. It was not officially removed from the psychiatric manual until 1952, when it was replaced by more specific diagnoses like conversion disorder. But it never regained its former prominence. The diagnosis that had affected millions of women, that had driven a massive industry, that had been the most common reason for women to visit physicians, essentially vanished. Its legacy, however, persisted. Women reporting medical concerns continued to be dismissed as hysterical. The term became a shorthand for dismissing women's experiences, for suggesting that female complaints were emotional rather than physiological, subjective rather than objective, imaginary rather than real. The specific diagnosis disappeared, but the underlying assumption that women's suffering could be dismissed as neurotic or emotional remained deeply embedded in medical culture. It was not until the 1960s, with the work of researchers like William Masters and Virginia Johnson, that female sexuality was approached with any real scientific rigor. Masters and Johnson conducted their famous studies of human sexual response, documenting through careful observation and measurement what women's bodies actually experienced during sexual arousal and orgasm. They were not discovering something new. They were finally documenting what had been happening in Victorian physicians' offices for over a century. The entire ecosystem, the diagnosis, the treatment, the devices, the marketing, the cultural assumptions that made it all possible, had become a massive, profitable industry built on a systematic misunderstanding of female bodies and the deliberate erasure of female sexuality. Then everything changed, and the catalyst came from an unexpected direction. Sigmund Freud is not generally remembered as a liberator of female sexuality, and for good reason. His theories about penis envy, his insistence that healthy women should experience only vaginal orgasms, not clitoral ones, his various pronouncements about women, these were deeply problematic and damaging. But on one crucial point, Freud broke with Victorian medical consensus. He acknowledged that women had sexual desires. More importantly, he recognized that hysteria might have psychological rather than purely physical causes. He suggested that symptoms of hysteria could be rooted in emotional trauma, in repressed experiences, in psychological rather than physiological dysfunction. This was not revolutionary thinking by modern standards, but in the context of late 19th century medicine, it was radical. Freud's ideas began to shift how the medical profession thought about hysteria. If the condition was psychological rather than purely physical, then manual pelvic massage might not be the appropriate treatment. Psychoanalysis might be more effective. The entire therapeutic framework began to shift. Younger physicians began to question the traditional approach. Medical conferences started hosting debates about whether hysteria was being properly understood. The certainty that had characterized physician attitudes toward hysteria treatment began to fracture, just slightly at first, then more significantly. What those research studies confirmed was exactly what those Victorian women knew but could not say. The hysterical paroxysm that physicians had been inducing was simply an orgasm, the response documented so carefully in medical literature. The muscular contractions, the flushing, the rapid breathing, the sensation of release followed by profound relaxation. was a textbook description of female sexual response. The numbers, when you step back and look at them, are staggering. If we take conservative estimates, if we assume that only 10% of adult women in major American cities received hysteria treatment between 1850 and 1920, and that they received an average of 20 treatment sessions each over their lifetimes, we are talking about tens of millions of medically administered orgasms, possibly hundreds of millions. This was not a marginal practice affecting a small subset of women. This was mainstream medicine, touching the lives of an enormous portion of the female population. Some women received treatment weekly for decades. Some received treatment twice weekly. Some would travel to European spas and receive multiple treatments daily for weeks at a time. The cumulative number of sexual experiences facilitated by the medical system, experienced by women who were supposed to be incapable of such experiences, is almost impossible to quantify. What is most striking is how the entire medical profession managed to participate in this without recognizing what was happening. This was not fringe practitioners or marginal clinics. These were respected physicians, trained at prestigious medical schools, publishing in respected journals, treating wealthy patients in elite urban practices. They had access to detailed anatomical knowledge. They had years of medical training. They had first-hand experience with human bodies and human responses. Yet they remained blind because the culture around them had constructed an elaborate framework of denial around female sexuality. The blindness was not accidental. It was systematic, maintained through careful omission in medical education, reinforced through professional consensus, protected by cultural assumptions so fundamental that they seemed like simple facts of nature. Every element of the system worked to maintain the fiction. Medical textbooks that omitted the clitoris or dismissed by scientific training from the assumptions of the society curricula that did not mention female sexual pleasure, well-intentioned professional terminology that allowed physicians to describe sexual acts in purely clinical language. Architectural arrangements of examination rooms, the sheet placement, the covered face, the specific positioning that allowed everyone to maintain the pretense that nothing sexual was occurring. It was a conspiracy of silence, except everyone involved actually believed what they were saying. The physicians genuinely thought they were treating a disease. The patients, while perhaps understanding at some intuitive level what was happening, could not articulate it in a language that existed. The medical journals published detailed descriptions of the procedures without anyone saying the forbidden word. This history matters profoundly because it reveals something disturbing about how medicine works. Medical practice is not immune to cultural bias. It is not protected by scientific training from the assumptions of the society it exists within. Brilliant, educated, well-intentioned physicians can be so blinded by cultural consensus that they perform the same action thousands of times without recognizing its true nature. The treatment of hysteria represents perhaps history's most elaborate example of collective denial. But it is not unique. Throughout medical history, physicians have failed to recognize obvious truths because those truths contradicted cultural assumptions. Women's pain has been systematically minimized because women were assumed to be more prone to exaggeration. Symptoms have been dismissed as psychological because they did not fit existing diagnostic categories. Treatments have been denied because they contradicted beliefs about what women should want or need. Yet the women knew. They remembered. Some wrote about it later, though necessarily in guarded language, using medical terminology they had learned from their physicians. Others never spoke of it, maintaining the silence throughout their lives, carrying the memory of those appointments as a private understanding of something the world insisted was not real. The next time someone dismisses a woman's medical complaint as hysteria or anxiety or emotional rather than physical, remember this history. For over 2 centuries, the medical profession gave women orgasms while maintaining that female sexuality did not exist. They were so blinded by cultural assumptions that they could not recognize the obvious. They performed this blind treatment thousands of times daily without understanding what they were doing. This was not ignorance in the sense of lack of information. The anatomical knowledge existed. The information was available. This was chosen ignorance, cultural ignorance, systematic ignorance built into education, reinforced by professional consensus, protected by everyone's mutual need to maintain the pretense. Think about the mechanisms through which this blindness was maintained. Medical textbooks existed. Detailed anatomical drawings were produced. Physicians dissected cadavers and studied anatomy. Yet the most sensitive part of female anatomy, the clitoris, was either omitted, misidentified, or explicitly dismissed as insignificant. Medical students graduated from prestigious institutions without ever learning that the clitoris had any functional purpose beyond reproduction. This was not accidental. It was systematic erasure from the very education system supposed to teach physicians how human bodies worked. The vibrator's journey from respected medical device to taboo sexual implement reveals the fragility of medical legitimacy. The device did not change. Its function did not change. What changed was the cultural context in which it existed. Once the sexual nature of the act became undeniable, the entire medical edifice supporting it collapsed almost instantly. This reminds us that medical practice exists at the intersection of science and culture. Sometimes they align. Sometimes they are in direct contradiction. When they conflict, culture often wins, at least temporarily, and the cost of that victory falls disproportionately on the vulnerable. For the women who sought treatment for hysteria, there was perhaps an irony worth noting. In a society that denied them sexuality, that told them respectable women had no sexual desires, that confined them to narrow domestic roles, the medical system inadvertently provided something they could not get elsewhere: regular, sanctioned sexual satisfaction. It was wrapped in medical language. It was performed by authority figures who did not admit what they were doing. It was structured within systems designed to maintain propriety and deny the obvious. But it was sex, and for many women, it was the only sex they would ever experience. The treatment ended not because physicians suddenly understood what they were doing, but because the culture could no longer maintain the necessary denial. It was the only sex they would ever experience. Once the sexual purpose of the device not because physicians suddenly understood what they were doing, system of pretense but collapsed. Because the culture could no longer maintain physicians who had been treating hysteria patients weekly suddenly stopped, because the cultural context that made the practice possible had shifted irreversibly. What happened to those women afterward is part of the larger story of how women's health concerns came to be systematized and dismissed. Without the medical framing that had made regular sexual satisfaction acceptable, women returned to the reality of living in a society that denied their sexuality. The relief they had found evaporated, but the memory of it remained, even if it could not be articulated. Some women likely experienced what we might now recognize as withdrawal or loss. For years, perhaps decades, they had received regular sexual attention, had experienced pleasure, had found relief in these appointments, and suddenly it ended. Not because their condition had been cured. There was no condition to cure. Hysteria had never been a real disease. But because society's willingness to maintain the pretense had collapsed. The language of medicine itself became a vehicle for denial. By creating clinical terminology for what was happening, paroxysm, therapeutic induction, hysteric response, physicians could discuss the procedures in academic journals, in medical conferences, in written case studies, all without ever using language that acknowledged the sexual nature of what was occurring. A physician could write a detailed paper describing the technique for inducing paroxysms, complete with specific instructions about pressure and motion and duration, and present it to colleagues as though discussing blood pressure measurement techniques. The very architecture of the examination rooms reinforced the denial. The sheet placement that covered the woman's face was not just about her modesty. It was about both parties maintaining the ability to pretend this was not happening. If you cannot see someone's face, if you are not maintaining eye contact, if the environment is clinical and cold and professional, then perhaps you can convince yourself that the most intimate physical contact you are having with another person is purely medical in nature. Professional consensus made this all possible when colleagues were not questioning the practice, when medical journals were publishing articles about it matter-of-factly, when prestigious physicians were recommending it, when other doctors' offices had the same setup and procedures. It became normalized. Deviation from the established practice seemed risky. Questioning it seemed unnecessary. Everyone was doing it this way, so it must be correct. The power of peer consensus to blind people to obvious truths cannot be overstated. The vibrator itself survived this history. After disappearing from medical practice in the 1920s, it re-emerged in the 1960s and beyond as an explicitly sexual device marketed to women for purposes that no longer required medical justification. The device that had treated hysteria became a tool for female sexuality that could be discussed openly. The transformation from medical to sexual device was not actually a transformation at all. It was simply a shift in what people were willing to admit about what the device did. That shift matters, not because admitting the sexual purpose made the vibrator more valuable or more legitimate, but because it allowed the full truth to finally emerge. What physicians had been doing without understanding it could finally be named. What women had been experiencing without being able to articulate it could finally be acknowledged. The story of Victorian hysteria treatment is not really about medical error, though there was plenty of that. It is about how culture shapes the boundaries of what people can perceive and acknowledge. It is about how systematic denial can persist across an entire profession for generations, maintained through omission and careful language and mutual agreement not to ask difficult questions. And it is a reminder that modern medicine, for all our advances, still exists within a culture. We still have blind spots. We still have areas where cultural assumptions override scientific evidence. We still have professional consensuses that might collapse under scrutiny. The difference is that now, hopefully, we are aware of the potential for this kind of blindness. We can look for it. We can question assumptions. We can resist the comfortable fiction that authority plus specialized knowledge equals understanding. The Victorian physicians were not monsters. They were not intentionally harming women. They were working within the framework their culture had constructed, following protocols their profession endorsed, acting on beliefs their education had instilled. And yet they were systematically misunderstanding what they were doing and why. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this history. Not the specific details of what happened, but the recognition that it could happen. That systems of knowledge practiced by educated people with genuine good intentions could be fundamentally mistaken about something they dealt with daily, and that the mechanism by which they maintained this mistake was so elegant, so systematic, that it took an explicit intrusion of sexual content, stag films of all things, to finally break through the denial. Consider what it means that pornography became the vehicle for truth. That it took the most stigmatized form of media, the most socially condemned artistic expression, to finally force the medical establishment to confront the obvious. The irony is almost too perfect. Hysteria treatment was so deeply embedded in denial that pornography, the ultimate representation of taboo sexuality, was the only thing crude enough, explicit enough, undeniable enough to break through the layers of medical and cultural pretense. Modern medicine likes to distance itself from this history, to position it as evidence of how far we have come, how much better our understanding is now. And in many ways, that is true. We know more about female anatomy. We acknowledge female sexuality. Women physicians practice openly, bringing different perspectives to medical training and practice. But has the fundamental problem been solved? Have we actually addressed the mechanisms that allowed this kind of systematic blindness to persist? Or have we simply shifted the forms it takes? Women still report that their pain is dismissed, that their symptoms are attributed to anxiety or stress rather than investigated thoroughly, that they are labeled as hysterical in modern form, too emotional, too sensitive, too quick to blame medical causes for what might be psychological. The language has changed, but the underlying dismissal persists. Different diagnoses are being overused or misused now. Different assumptions are guiding medical practice in ways we do not yet recognize. So instead, the entire history was erased. Within 50 years of the practice ending, it was almost impossible to find in medical literature. It was treated as an embarrassing footnote, something that happened to medicine in the past, but that modern medicine had moved beyond. The historians and sociologists and physicians who eventually researched this history found they had to piece it together from scattered references, old medical journals, patient testimonies, and devices still sitting in museums. What we are left with is a historical episode so bizarre, so counterintuitive that it almost seems fabricated. The idea that millions of women received medical treatment that was explicitly sexual in nature, all while everyone involved maintained that female sexuality did not exist, contradicts our basic assumptions about how knowledgeable people behave. It seems like something that could not have happened. And yet it did. For over 70 years at peak practice, spanning continents, involving thousands of practitioners and millions of patients, it was systematized, professionalized, marketed, discussed in academic publications, performed in prestigious medical institutions, and almost nobody recognized what was actually occurring. Yet somehow the truth persisted. Despite the systematic efforts to deny, omit, and erase the reality of these treatments, the record remained. Women's memories, the devices themselves, the medical journals and case studies, the patient testimonials, all of it survived. And eventually, when culture shifted enough that the sexual nature of these practices could no longer be denied, the truth emerged. This persistence of truth against systematic denial is perhaps the most encouraging aspect of the story. No matter how comprehensive the attempt to deny reality, to erase it from official records, to pretend it never happened, the evidence remains. The vibrators survived in museums and private collections. The medical journals remained in archives. The women who experienced these treatments passed down their memories, even if only in coded language or diary entries. History does not disappear just because we refuse to acknowledge it. It waits. It persists. And when the conditions change, when the cultural context shifts enough, the truth can finally emerge into the light. This is the final and perhaps most important lesson of the hysteria treatment history. Our blindness to obvious truths is not evidence that those truths do not exist. The fact that the medical profession could not see what it was doing does not mean it was not happening. The fact that everyone involved maintained they were engaging in medical practice does not mean they were not engaging in something sexual. Reality does not wait for our permission to exist. Somewhere in these contemporary times in modern medical practice, there are almost certainly equivalent blindnesses. Things that are happening regularly, that are being discussed in professional literature, that are being performed by educated practitioners in reputable institutions that future generations will look back on with the same bewilderment we feel looking at Victorian hysteria treatment. We probably cannot see what they are. That is the nature of cultural blindness. But they are there. The mechanisms that created the Victorian medical blindness are still present in medical education, still embedded in professional culture, still protected by the human capacity for systematic denial.